right, welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. Happy Monday. I'm Aaron Brightman. As always, this episode is brought to you by Knights of the Raritan, the Rutgers NIL Collective. Click on the link in the description of this episode to join their free newsletter. Find out what's going on within Knights of the Raritan. They have a lot of things going on upcoming with the fall season soon to begin, and also how to become a member of Knights of the Raritan to support Rutgers student athletes with NIL. This episode is going to cover Big Ten Media Days. Can't believe it's here. Begins in Indianapolis on Tuesday. Rutgers will appear on Tuesday, and also wanted to run through the Cleveland.com, the kind of unofficial media poll. 32 media members polled, and they give their 1 through 18 now with the newly expanded Big Ten projections for the season, where Rutgers landed, and also just kind of some other things to watch for on media days coming up. Run through the schedule a little bit as well. So this could be a good resource as you are looking to consume college football content back this week for the Big Ten. Training camp will begin next week. We are really close being into August when Rutgers football actually has a official football game. So it is still super hot here in the summer, late July, but we are getting really close to things picking up here, and it's very exciting. Let's start with the Cleveland.com projected poll. Brian Fonseca and Pat Lanny of NJ.com participated in the poll. So there's 32 media members throughout that cover the conference from a beat perspective. And Rutgers was named number 9th in the preseason poll. Pretty solid. I was really curious to see where they would land. I thought anywhere from kind of 8 to 12, honestly. So I think 9th is pretty fair. I know some Rutgers fans probably think that was a little too low. They should have been higher than that. But overall, I think it shows that there is a certain level of respect and expectation across the conference now for Rutgers football. There was also a good preview article from The Athletic that came out either Sunday or early Monday morning. And there were 5 different beat writers that were polled in it for The Athletic. And one of the questions was which team could surprise in the Big Ten this year. And Scott Docterman that covers Iowa, he specifically said Rutgers. And he said that he thinks they could get to 9 wins based on the schedule. So seeing national media be higher on Rutgers than they have been probably since they've ever been in the Big Ten, certainly encouraging, certainly warranted as well. We'd be disappointed if that wasn't the case. And maybe we all hope that there was even more buzz from a national perspective. And I think that is, obviously, this is a Rutgers podcast. You're Rutgers fans. That's going to be something very interesting to watch for in Big Ten Media Days in terms of, first of all, one thing to look at is in terms of Greg Schiano's press conference. He will speak at 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, July 23rd, live on BTN. He'll be the second coach to go, following Brett Bielema of Illinois at 11:30. The commissioner, Tony Petitti, will speak beforehand to kick things off. One thing I always look for Rutgers coaches at Big Ten Media Days for press conferences is how much of the national media are actually asking questions, or other media across the conference. How much are they asking the Rutgers coaches questions? Because for many years when Rutgers was not good, basketball, football, women's basketball, there were no other questions coming from any outside media other than the local beat guys that were there for Rutgers. So Schiano is much more of a national brand. They've gotten some outside questions in the past, but I'm curious to see how many questions he gets just from the conference media on Tuesday outside of the local beat guys that will be there. And, there is some buzz there. And to finish 9th, let's just kind of run through the 1 through 18 projections from Cleveland.com, the 32 media writers that wrote on the unofficial ballot, unofficial poll. Big Ten themselves do not put out an actual Big Ten preseason poll like they do for a lot of other sports. So noted there. But Ohio State, number 1, Oregon, number 2, Penn State, number 3, Michigan, number 4, Iowa, number 5, USC, number 6. I've seen this pretty much across the board all offseason in terms of how the Big Ten is looked at from a media perspective. And that was pretty much the consensus top 6 from everywhere I've seen this offseason. So that's not surprising at all. What is encouraging is that Rutgers does not play the top 5 this season in the regular season. And that is a big reason why a lot of people are optimistic that Rutgers could win at least 8, 9, possibly more games this season, avoiding the big three of Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State, but then also not having to play Iowa, not having to play Oregon. What is fascinating about the poll, which really there's no big surprises in terms of all the preseason power polls I've seen, it's very much in line with what I've seen. But Rutgers has been lower in some I've seen where they haven't been in the top half. So number 9 is, I think, solid in terms of the schedule for Rutgers. Like I said, the one thing that I do think is very sums up the whole season in terms of what the ceiling and floor could be is there are so many 50-50 matchup games that are on the schedule. So you have USC at number 6, Wisconsin at number 7, Nebraska at number 8, Rutgers at number 9, Washington at number 10, Maryland at number 11, Minnesota at number 12, Illinois at number 13. So the 3 teams ahead of Rutgers, USC, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and the 4 teams behind them, Washington, Maryland, Minnesota, Illinois. Rutgers plays them all. So there is not a lot of margin there between those teams, in that a lot of those games could go either way. And obviously Rutgers is at USC, Wisconsin at home, at Nebraska, Washington at home, at Maryland, Minnesota, and Illinois at home. Then you have Northwestern polled 14th, not on the schedule. UCLA 15th at home, homecoming for Rutgers. Michigan State 16th at Michigan State to end the regular season. And then the 2 bottom teams in the poll, Indiana and Purdue, not on the schedule. So very intriguing schedule, reiterated by this poll. A lot of 50-50 toss-up games, and that's what I've been saying all offseason is that, yes, those most likely pretty much surefire losses are off the schedule, but I don't believe that there's any surefire wins added to the schedule. You have, obviously, Howard, you have Akron, right? You have to win those games. But the other 10 on the schedule, which includes at Virginia Tech, I really could see all of them going either way. You know, even at USC, I mean, they're going to be good. There's questions about, replacing Caleb Williams, but it's not so daunting. But also, it's not they're not going to be favored, I doubt. Although I guess it depends late October where those 2 programs are at that stage. But right now, going into the season, you would not anticipate Rutgers to be favored. So I think that's the other thing in terms of looking at these games. How Rutgers is going to Virginia Tech. They'll be coming off a bye. Will they be favored in that game? I think probably not, even though they beat Virginia Tech last year. Blacksburg, one of the toughest places to play. Of course, we'll see how Virginia Tech is at that point. Washington at home, I think there's a chance now they could be favored in that game at Nebraska. Unlikely, even if they are 4-0. Of course, if Nebraska has a rough start, as they have in many years. But there's no games on the schedule. Wisconsin at home, they could be favored. They could be underdogs at home. UCLA, there's a good chance they could be favored. At Maryland, I mean, Rutgers has not done well against Maryland. Again, these late games in the season, November, could go either way. It's going to obviously depend on how those programs are doing throughout the season. But on paper, there's no, you can't look at the schedule and say Rutgers can be favored in 9, 10 games. They're not. Unlikely to be. So we'll see. But from a conference perspective, going into media days here, it's a 3-day event now. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Let's just run through the schedule here in terms of BTN, the programs and coaches that will be speaking at the podium. Everyone will have players there as well. Those will be media sessions. I believe every program will be at the BTN studio at some point. So Rutgers will be out sometime Tuesday afternoon. But you have Illinois, Rutgers, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Purdue, and Ohio State in that order from 11:30 to 1 o'clock on Tuesday. On Wednesday, you have UCLA, Iowa, Michigan State, USC, Nebraska, Penn State from 11:30 to 1. And then on Thursday, July 25th, you have Oregon, Minnesota, Maryland, Washington, Indiana, and Michigan. You have the new Big Ten schools. Obviously, that will be buzzworthy at the conference media days. None are actually appearing on Tuesday when Rutgers is there. But, you also have new Michigan coach Sharon Moore, no more Jim Harbaugh. So that will be certainly at the top of the list in terms of media noteworthy things to look for if you're just a Big Ten fan in perspective. You also have just the fact that the attention of Oregon transitioning in, they're likely to be a top 10 team this season. Coach Dan Lanning, one of the better. He's a big name coach, personality, adding to the conference now. You have Jed Fish, the new coach at Washington. That's an intriguing storyline. And then obviously UCLA and USC coming to the conference. So that will be buzzworthy this week at Media Days. I'm sure Tony Petitti will comment on a lot of the business side of things in regard to the House ruling versus the NCAA and what that might mean for paying student athletes as early as next year. So there'll be some interesting comments to look for there. Also in terms of just NIL, transfer portal, all of that stuff. How is that asked across the media to all the coaches, getting takes from that perspective? And also, obviously, the Big Ten commissioner. That would be something to look for. So a lot of news could come out. Obviously, Media Days, a lot of coach speak. From a Rutgers perspective, what are we looking for? Obviously, Tyreen Powell will be there along with Kyle Monangai and Mohamed Toure. So we'll probably get an update on Tyreen Powell's injury status. Again, you don't send, I said this last week, you don't send a player to Media Days if there's any threat that he's not going to be available pretty close to the start of the season. So the expectation always has been set by Greg Schiano that Powell will be ready for the start of the season. So I'm sure we'll get an update there. Kyle Monangai had the 7th most votes in the Cleveland.com unofficial Big Ten poll for Offensive Player of the Year. He finished 7th. Not surprising there. Even though he led the Big Ten in rushing, he's not going to be at the top of anyone's list. And that's not disrespect to Kyle Monangai. And that's just the reality of being a Rutgers player. And also, I think, Monangai has a lot more to prove, which is a great thing for Kyle Monangai and Rutgers. You want Kyle Monangai with a chip on his shoulder because no one runs harder and no one runs more aggressively than Kyle Monangai in this league right now when he has a chip on his shoulder. And we've seen him exceed expectations time and time again. And him coming in as the returning leading rusher of the conference rushing title last season in the Big Ten and not being considered a top 3-4 offensive player in the league, that is a good thing to have on the bulletin board for not only Kyle Monangai, but the Rutgers offense. So I'm pleased that he was voted 7th. That's great. Get at it. And just in terms of the rest of the Rutgers players, it'll be interesting to hear from Mohamed Toure, who I think is, their most valuable defensive player. And just in terms of how this team, the leaders that are back, so many veterans, so many starters returning, and get a little more insight in terms of their mindset and the mentality of this team and just how amped up they are for this season and what it can mean for the program and their legacies as players. There's a lot on the line, and this is really the start of it, is Big Ten Media Days. So to hear from them would be great. Greg Schiano's messaging, I'm sure he'll be asked about the decision to start Ethan Kaliakmanis and the departure of Gavin Wimsatt. So get a little more insight there from him. And also just to hear about progress in terms of the offense and defense, just off-season improvements that he feels like the roster has made. But overall, earth-shattering news out of Schiano or the players. But listen, like I said, it starts the process. It's the start of the 24 season from a media perspective. Training camp will begin the following week. Probably get some details there in terms of what that schedule is going to look like. So just very exciting times for Rutgers football and for Rutgers football fans that here we are. This season is going to be as anticipated as any. Since Schiano's returned, for sure, the most anticipated season going in, arguably, other than the initial season when Rutgers did have a good year, its best year in the Big Ten. But in terms of a hype perspective, in terms of credibility perspective, in terms of real expectations of what this team can do, I mean, in terms of finishing with a Big Ten winning record, in terms of finishing in the top half, I mean, can they challenge? Can they be a top 3rd team? Can they finish in that top 6 with the schedule they have? If they could stay healthy, if the defense can take another step, if the offense can take several steps forward, if execution can be at a really high level, and this team can click in all cylinders, yes, this team could win 9, 10, maybe more games. Is it likely? A lot has to happen. A lot has to go the right way for them. Just in terms of expectations, I think a lot of fans are hoping for at least 8 wins, we'll get more into that as previewing the season ahead for Rutgers. But it's going to be really interesting to see just in terms of how expectations grow with every win, disappointment with any loss. I mean, every game in football, there's only so many. So they're weighted so heavily in the emotions of it and what it means for the outlook of the season. But there's just so much high hopes going in for many good reasons. So I'm excited to see how Rutgers is received at Big Ten Media Days on Tuesday. And I'll have some kind of reaction pod to Media Days at some point. But I really was curious how they would come out in this poll. Again, Rutgers projected to be 9th, 32 media writers, Cleveland.com. Two of our own, Brian Fonseca and Pat Lanny, do a great job. They were the voters on the Rutgers beat. But 9th overall, Ohio State 1, Oregon 2, Penn State 3, Michigan 4, Iowa 5. No surprises there. None are on the Rutgers schedule for Big Ten play. USC 6, Wisconsin 7, Nebraska 8, Rutgers 9. If you're a Rutgers fan, you're thinking, hey, USC, Wisconsin, Nebraska, can they win 2 out of 3? I mean, of those 3, Wisconsin's the only home game. That is the game that, a lot of people looked to last year as the one that slipped away with that pick 6, how they were playing them in Camp Randall. They gave them all they could handle for a good part of that game. That's a game that everyone from the Rutgers side is going to look at on the schedule and think in early October, Rutgers can get that win. If they can get that win, that certainly points them in the right direction of 8+ wins for the season. Obviously, that Virginia Tech game is huge, and we'll talk about that plenty from a Big Ten perspective. And then the week before, you're at Nebraska. So just think about this scenario. You're at Virginia Tech week 3. You host Washington on Friday night, week 4. Then you're at Nebraska. You host Wisconsin. Then you host UCLA. So those are 4 games in Big Ten play. Washington at home, at Nebraska, Wisconsin at home, UCLA at home. Rutgers has a real chance to get out to a great start, not only just overall, but in Big Ten play as well. So that is really going to be the key to building success. And as it was last year, they started 6-2. The schedule got way harder in November. It's not the same type of level in November this year. Seasons have a way of kind of, going off the skews a little bit. If 1 or 2 things happen, obviously injuries is a big part of that. Or if you have proper momentum going in and you're just winning games that are 50-50 games, that can really snowball in a positive direction. So it's going to be a wild ride. Rutgers picked 9th in the Big Ten. I think they can do better than that. I think it's a fair prediction. I was worried that maybe they were going to be picked 12th and we would all feel disrespected. I don't think, from a player perspective, I don't think it matters. I think this team is properly motivated. They know the opportunity they have ahead of them. They know that even at 9th, they have a real chance to prove people wrong and surprise people. But they are on the radar of some national media in terms of being a surprise team in the Big Ten. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that at Big Ten Media Days. Stay tuned for news that comes out there. I'll have a reaction to it probably on Tuesday. I have a basketball pod coming up as well. So stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for listening and watching here at the Scarlet Faithful Podcast once again.